France's two presidential candidates in full campaign flow to pick up voters left undecided, especially after fourth-place Mélenchon remains silent over his endorsement. International donors pledge €1 billion to Yemen in an effort to ease the world's largest humanitarian crisis caused by 2 years of conflict. And like making an arsonist into the town fire chief, a stinging verdict on a vote to add ultra-conservative Saudi Arabia to the UN Women's Rights Commission. Hello, good to have you with us. I'm Belle Lupton, here for you with the latest. And we begin here in France, where the battle is on between the far right and the centre, ahead of a second round of voting in the presidential election. Front National leader Marine Le Pen has spent the day at Paris's world-famous Rungis market, campaigning for working-class votes. She called for more food to be produced within France for the French.
The best solution is to stop integral free trade, which means we have frontiers and we protect ourselves from unlawful competition, because otherwise we're all going to die. Emmanuel Macron talks like the manager of a large corporation, whip in hand, who only cares about results and wouldn't hesitate to sack anyone.
Well, meanwhile, centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron has spent the day canvassing the all-important undecided voters in Lyon. He then used a TV appearance to highlight the differences between himself and Le Pen. He said her platform is based on hatred for others, whilst his is a desire to calm the country.
D'abord, quand j'entends Madame Le Pen,
when I hear Marine Le Pen, what she says, the way she speaks, her gestures, there is a real sense of brutality on her side, because she's proposing a brutal, heinous political project, one of rejection. That's not my campaign. On the other hand, I'm not offering some happy, naive vision of globalization, but we are a part of the world. France is a part of the world.
Well, after Macron and Le Pen, the candidates with the most votes in last Sunday's first round were François Fillon and Jean-Luc Mélenchon. The Conservative candidate has already endorsed Macron for the next round, joining socialist Benoît Hamon and President François Hollande. But Mélenchon's refusal to do the same has been controversial. The far-left candidate says it's not up to him, but his party faithful to decide. So he's put it to them to vote on his website. Earlier, we asked Dr. David Leese, a professor in French studies at the University of Warwick in the UK, what he makes of this decision.
Mélenchon's failure to endorse Macron could be seen by some, certainly by some mainstream members of the French population and indeed political classes, as being rather irresponsible. I would suggest that he's perhaps really ensuring he has no fault in the election results whatsoever. Very sort of, in some ways, a shrewd political move perhaps, but in some ways arguably rather unclear and certainly not very helpful from the point of view of Macron. I would say perhaps it does. I mean, it clearly does leave the door open for some of his supporters to go and back the Front National and Le Pen in the second round, which for Le Pen is no bad thing.
In one of his final acts as president, François Hollande has led tributes to Xavier Jugelé, the French police officer killed in last Thursday's gun attack. Jugelé was in the driver's seat of a police van on the Champs-Élysées when he was shot and killed by an attacker with an assault rifle. Earlier, Jugelé's partner, Étienne Cardilès, said he refused to hate the attacker, following in the footsteps of a writer who lost a family member in November 2015's attack on the Bataclan here in Paris.
I suffer without hatred. I borrow this expression from Antoine Léris, whose immense wisdom in the face of pain I admire so much that I read and reread his writings a few months ago. It is a lesson in life that has made me grow up so much that it protects me today. When the first messages were issued informing the Parisians that a serious event was taking place on the Champs-Élysées and that a policeman had lost his life, a small voice told me that it was you, and so I recalled this generous and healing expression. You will not have my hatred.
International donors have pledged just over €1 billion to Yemen after a day-long aid conference organised by the UN, Switzerland and Sweden. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres called it an encouraging signal in the push to ease the world's largest humanitarian crisis. 17 million people in Yemen are classified as food insecure after 2 years of conflict. Well, earlier we spoke to our correspondent in Geneva, John Zaracostas. He gave us the details of this agreement.
UN Secretary-General Mr. Antonio Guterres was gratified at the end of the session that of the 2.1 billion that are required to provide emergency assistance to the Yemeni population, they came up with new pledges totaling $1.1 billion. That's a fair amount considering we're only in April. So Mr. Guterres is optimistic that more money will come down the road. There were some new contributions, major contributions by the United Kingdom, who granted 139 million pounds, the European Commission 116 million euros, and neighbouring countries, Saudi Arabia 150 million, and Kuwait 100 million, and neighbouring UAE also 100 million. And the United States came in with $94 million in new funds. So that's a fair amount. But the question is, will this money be translated into real aid and reach the people? And a total of 19 million people in Yemen require humanitarian assistance. On this total, 17 million are food insecure. Of this amount, about 7 million are in dire straits and they don't know where their next meal will come. So, as David Beasley, the new chief of the World Food Programme, said, the agencies are racing against time to be able to get the money and the supplies and reach the people in need.
Human rights groups have been reacting with outrage after Saudi Arabia was elected to the UN Women's Rights Commission. The ultra-conservative Islamic kingdom bans women from driving cars and has a state policy of gender segregation between unrelated men and women. It's now one of 45 countries sitting on a panel promoting women's rights across the world. At least 5 EU states voted in a secret ballot for the Saudis to serve a 4-year term on that commission. The director of UN Watch compared the decision to making an arsonist into a town fire chief. Earlier, we spoke to him about what might have prompted a vote in Saudi Arabia's favour.
Sadly, the United Nations too often fails to live up to the noble principles of its charter. We have politics, and in this case, petrodollars that supersede principles. Human rights activists sitting in prison, like Raif Badawi, a blogger who's sitting in Saudi prison for the crime of calling for democracy, it's to demoralize them. Or Manal al-Sharif, the woman who was arrested for driving a car. Imagine how she feels when she sees the headline that her oppressor, Saudi Arabia, has just been chosen by the United Nations to have a position of influence on women's rights. It's a kick in the stomach. Those are the reasons and the only reasons why Saudi Arabia has pursued this absurd, paradoxical membership.
And finally, you may be familiar with dating apps, but how about this? A dating app for animals. That's what scientists have been pushed into setting up. It's in order to save a certain older male from extinction. Simon Harding has the story.
The most unusual Tinder profile. Sudan is taking the dating app by storm. He's outdoorsy and loves to travel, but here's the issue. He's the last male northern white rhino in the world. Conservationists are hoping the Tinder profile, which leads to a fundraising page, will help them raise $9 million to save the species.
Tinder is going to launch a profile for our rhino Sudan. It's going to be broadcasted in 190 countries and in 40 languages, which is really the first time Tinder does something like that.
Sudan's profile reads, "I don't mean to be too forward, but the fate of my species literally depends on me. I perform well under pressure, 6 feet tall and 5,000 pounds if it matters. The rhino is the equivalent of 90 years old and therefore too old to reproduce by himself. Scientists want to use Sudan's sperm to fertilize the egg of one of the 2 remaining female white rhinos who are sterile, and then the egg would be carried by a surrogate southern white rhino."
The only way of saving this species now is through artificial reproductive techniques. primarily something which you will be familiar with called in vitro fertilization. So in vitro fertilization is something that has been done in humans since the 1960s and is common practice nowadays in infertile couples.
The Olpejeta Conservancy are hoping enough Tinder swipes will allow them to collect the required money. Perhaps they need not worry. The number of Sudan's admirers was so high that their website crashed just hours after he went online.
Well, there you go. If you want to join those admirers, just swipe right and you too could be saving a rhino. I'll be back shortly with another bulletin for you. Do join me then.
Soon the French will elect a new head of state. Who will be